So we're raising our own chickens for the main reason that we want to grow quality food. Now, quality food is everything we eat, so it's basically a diet or a balanced diet. For a balanced diet, you need to incorporate, you need a healthy landscape. And if you consider everything starting with the soil, that means that you need a healthy soil or a quality soil. A quality soil needs the interaction between plants and microorganisms in the soil. For the plant to grow, it puts sugars in the soil, and those sugars are food for the microorganisms that in return give the plant minerals to keep it breathe. So there's a symbiosis between the plant and the microorganisms, like there is a symbiosis between microorganisms in our gut system and on our skin that help us with our digestion and keep us healthy. And the same goes up for the chickens. The chickens live in symbiosis with microorganisms, the cows, all the animals. What is forgotten in agriculture is that microbial community and the synergies between the microbes in the soil and in the digestive systems of all the animals. There's a strong link there, and which brings in a qualitative force that we've basically underestimated, and we don't know enough about it, but it is there. So that's a generic background. At some point we can talk a bit more about that. But the long and the short of it is, for us to grow healthy vegetables, it means that we have to replenish the soil with microbial communities that are related to microbial communities of animals as well. So on top of that, within the manure of animals, there is a different ratio of nutrients. So for instance, if you look at pig manure and chicken manure, there's a relatively high amount of phosphorus in it. If you look at other manures, they've got other qualitative aspects. So the mixing of the different manures adds value to the soil, so that the plants, in which we have a broad diversity as well, some have a bigger demand on nitrogen, some have a bigger demand on phosphorus, and with the diversity of manures you get that recycled. So you're closing, basically, if you look at it generically, we are trying to close the energy loops on the farm and the nutrient loops on the farm by including what we historically knew mixed farming systems as being wholesome, and we're trying to get back to that, which brings us back to the chickens. In those days, chickens were on the farm and they were basically being raised on scraps. So they were free-ranged, and they basically wandered around between other animals, finding their own food, and sometimes they got some kitchen scraps and everything else. But the eggs, as such, were basically free. They were just collected as free. There was no inputs required. There was no feed brought in for the chickens whatsoever. That has two aspects to it. The genetics of the chicken was closely related to the farm aspect. So basically that means that every farm had its own chicken breed. Every region had its own chicken breed. So if you moved away 50 kilometers, all of a sudden you found a different type of chickens, and that meant that all the chickens were adapted to the farm and to that particular community. So there was a strong genetic base, very broad. The consequence of modern farming and industrialized farming has come with some disadvantages, that now modern chickens are being kept in an industrialized form, with all sorts of disadvantages from the point of view of having respect for life. Let's just put it that way. I don't want to dwell on all the negativities in industrial agriculture. People can look that up themselves, but we are going the opposite way. But the consequence of that process going on for about 200 years now means that there's only a small genetic pool of industrialized chickens, which basically are all hybrids, and you have the option of raising chickens for laying eggs, or you have the options of raising chickens for meat. One of the downsides of that is that if you raise chickens, you always get males and females. So in the case of you buying, I'm still focusing on the negatives, but I got to get this out because most people don't realize they have this nostalgic vision of farms and farming, and that vision relates back to 100 years ago. It's not like that anymore, even though the media still presents it that way. But anyway, if you buy chickens for eggs, it means that the other party, the males, are being dealt with as soon as they are born. So that just gets discarded. On the other side, where you have the meat chickens, the females get discarded immediately. Besides that being a waste, it's certainly not showing any respect for nature whatsoever. The reason why it's been done is because a farmer could specialize and could make a living out of keeping chickens.
On its own,
just chickens on their own, and they had to specialize, which means they didn't have to know that much, and it was relatively easy and straightforward, and you could industrialize it.
Yeah.
So it meant for the chickens that they're no longer able to show their normal behavior. It meant for the chickens that they became egg-laying machines more than anything else, and the genetics followed that. So we've now got chickens that lay an egg every day, one egg every day. They have been bred that way, so the genetics has focused on laying more eggs. But more importantly, for the chicken to lay an egg every day, they need high concentrated food. Now, for the chickens to be confined and hooked up together has a whole lot of consequences for disease and disease outbreaks. The combination with the genetics being focused on egg production and the lack of and the genetics becoming smaller and smaller meant that those chickens in confinement got diseased really quick. So
it's like monocultures, isn't it?
So to conquer the diseases, more and more antibiotics crept in, etc., etc. So basically, the chicken's no longer a chicken. It can't show its normal behavior, and it's just an egg-laying machine, which is being kept alive with concentrates and all sorts of supplements, positively and negatively. Again, don't want to dwell on that too much because people can find out more about that. But that leaves us, so the chicken manure actually coming out of those chickens, you can't even compost it because it's full of hormones and antibiotics. So if I would put that in my compost, it would kill half the microbial community in my compost that is supposed to digest it and turn it into humus. So it's it's a dead end, and that's the reason why we started farming ecologically or organically, and going back to building up that knowledge again. Now, we want healthy chickens with healthy manure that actually contribute. Like I said, we want the nutrients, and we want the microorganisms to add value to the soil, so that the plants get added value, so that we get quality food. And we would like to be our eggs free as well. It's really hard to create a starting point now, because what you can buy is either chickens from the industrial sector, and then you get chickens that do lay a lot of eggs, but we have to feed them lots of food. So we need to buy concentrates for them to lay an egg every day. If you don't, then they don't lay an awful lot of eggs, and the egg laying becomes very erratic. So while an industrialized chicken farmer, he knows exactly how many eggs he's got every day, and he can sell them accordingly. If we would do that, we would one day get so many eggs, and the other day so many eggs, it gets a bit hard to sell them. Yeah. On top of that, organic food for chickens is highly expensive, for the reason that adding protein into chicken food comes down to either fish meal or bone meal or
soy.
Putting in soy. Now, soy is highly expensive because on the open market the bulk of the soya meal is genetically modified soya meal, so there's only very small amounts of GE-free soya meal. So in the past we did buy that, but if we ran out of food we would bring, and then they say, no, we have no batch ready, it will be ready in 3 or 4 weeks, which would mean that we had no food. So we basically gone back to local seeds and grain, in which the peas, and replace the protein content. But yeah. So well, let's go back to the beginning. So you need to create a starting point. Now, we don't want to give them the expensive food. We do want healthy manure, and we do want healthy eggs, and we do want a reasonable amount of eggs, so that we can at least know how many eggs we can sell to people. There's no real research and no real experience with this outside in the world, and certainly not in New Zealand. So we had to do this by trial and error. I've got interested in this 15 years ago, and in those days I was looking at food quality, and there was this huge discussion about cholesterol in eggs, and we shouldn't be eating too many eggs because that would raise your cholesterol. Turns out there is a chicken that lays green eggs, and it's called an Araucana, and it had a better ratio between the omega fats, so it would be better for your cholesterol. So, and the disadvantage of that chicken was it had nice green eggs, but they were rather small, so they were hard to sell. But we set up a breeding program 15 years ago with those chickens, and trying to breed to get better eggs and big eggs. And in those days we had a shop in Carterton, from which we did a home delivery service, the organic home delivery service. That went really well, and we at some point we had 50 crossbred chickens that were producing a reasonable amount of eggs with a very low food input, so they were cheap eggs. But then we got 2 puppy dogs, Hopper and Chopper, which when they were youngsters they were quite boisterous. Basically, at some point in the time they killed half of the 50 chickens. So that's part of the learning process as well. It's something worthwhile talking about, dogs on the farm in the near future, because That's a critical topic too. But after that we got a little bit sidetracked, and when we started the market garden in Masterton, we knew that we had to make sure that the input market garden needs quite a bit of input, food wise and energy wise, nutrient wise. We knew that we had to make sure that we could add value to that with having manures. And although we are having a sheep breeding program and we're looking at a cow breeding program, the chickens was easier. We can't do everything at once. So we started with chickens, and because there is a limit, the law is a bit limiting to how many chickens you can keep on a property. We started with a small flock and we started adopting chickens. So we started crossbreeding some heirloom chickens with the hybrids. Basically, so that we mix up the genetics again. It would mean that we would lose egg production, but we're gonna have to find out. But it also would mean that we can reduce the amount of concentrates, so we don't have to buy all that expensive food. Now, it's a fine balance between finding out how far can you reduce it, and how long does the breeding take before you can reduce it all. So normally a chicken in an industrialized setting has to get all its protein out of the food on offer. In a setting like ours, so we know, for instance, that chickens can get 40 to 60% of their food value out of grass, but chickens only like short grass because that's more nutritious to them. Now if you look around, you see all the tufts and everything else. That's useless to the chickens. But if you then walk around here, you see that the shorter grass, they really enjoy that, and they get quite a lot of nutrients out of that. Now, so the chickens are only a part of the solution, because those tufts of grass, they're being useless to the chickens, but they would be alright for cows and sheep to graze in. So if what we're trying to do, we already have the sheep in here more regularly, but if we have combinations of cows and sheep, it would mean that the chicken would actually get more high quality grass for their purposes. And it's just one of the synergies that we're trying to explore on the farm as much as possible. You will find in other free-range chicken farms that most of the earth is bare. That's not really the intention. If you look around here, there's not much bare soil, except at the gate, which is where the chickens are accumulating because they want their food. And that's where the soil is a bit too exposed to trampling and everything. In the meantime, we have to breed our own chickens now, and that means we had to set up a breeding program. And although that seems to be reasonably straightforward, but having to replace 100 chickens once a year has become a bigger task than we anticipated. So at the moment, a year ago we didn't have a breeding center. Now we have a breeding center, but there's some childhood diseases with the breeding center that we're working on, and they can be solved with a bit more time and attention. But at the moment we are unable to replace enough chickens to keep on going with the adoption, to keep up with the adoption program. So as such, we have to make people aware of the issues that we're having, and try and find a way of carrying the program forward without upsetting the people that are interested in it. Basically, the lot of chickens that is in here, they're 2 years old, and we should have had replacements for them, and we don't have them. And it seems silly to go back to the hybrid chicken and go back to feeding them high concentrated food again. We would much rather have a bit of a break on the chicken adoption production process and focus on the breeding, and then take it back up in 3 months, 6 months or 9 months, whatever it's going to take.